Many Americans today are uninformed and unsure about America's founding fathers and their original intent for our nation's Constitution. Are there really traces of biblical truth and influence within the Constitution and other founding documents? Or do we have, as many historians now claim, a godless Constitution? Many people once believed the United States was a Christian nation, but what about today? What are the characteristics of such a nation? And is a Christian nation, as many historians now teach, an intolerant and cruel society? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. A closer look into our nation's history reveals surprising and irrefutable evidence of the Bible's influence on our founding fathers and our nation's Constitution. But does a biblically inspired Constitution make America a Christian nation? And is there a place for the Bible in today's society? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
For over 3 centuries, America was officially described as a Christian nation. There are over 300 court cases, both state and federal judiciary, saying America is a Christian nation. We have presidents, we have governors, we have state and federal legislatures. Everybody said it for 3 centuries. It's in all of our textbooks. But suddenly, in the last few decades, if someone has the audacity to say that America is a Christian nation, that's probably what will subject you to more attacks in current America than any other claim you can make.
Wow.
We collect articles on where people have the audacity to say America has Christian roots or foundations. They get called the American Taliban. They get called Islamic fundamentalists, but on the Christian side. They go through all these pejoratives. And the ones I enjoy a lot are the ones where they say, well, these are the same folks that Hitler used to move his regime forward. This is the same philosophy that Stalin used. This is fascism at its worst. They like to make those terms, and what I love to point to is, well, let's take folks like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Time after time after time, he called America a Christian nation in official addresses.
Wow.
Then he's followed by President Harry Truman, who also used the same term time after time, America is a Christian nation. And then we have Dwight D. Eisenhower, who also said America is a Christian nation. Now, those are 3 guys that specifically, individually fought against Hitler, against Stalin, and against fascism. So how can they be students of Hitler and students of Stalin? We're the guys who brought them to their knees, and yet they say we're a Christian nation. So what's happened is America has really lost its concept of its own roots. We have a group out on the radical left who has so demonized that term, made it so radioactive, that we're scared to say today what our history books taught for 300 years.
Wow.
And along with that, we've come into some really wrong conceptions, because the left has said, oh, if you're a Christian nation, then you're those guys that do the Inquisition. You're the guys that do the Crusades. You're into coercion. You're into forcing people to become Christians. You want a theocracy. That's what you're after. You're all theocrats. So they go through all these charges about what happens if someone says a Christian nation. Shows how little they know about history. Numbers of other founding fathers and early American political leaders also declared that America was guided by or founded on Christian principles. Among those making such declarations were Elias Boudinot, a president of Congress during the Revolution, and signers of the Declaration Charles Carroll, John Hancock, Benjamin Rush, Stephen Hopkins, and Samuel Adams. Also citing Christian principles as foundational are Constitution signers George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Rufus King, John Dickinson, and Roger Sherman. Others making similar declarations about Christian principles in America include Samuel Chase, a signer of the Declaration and a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Original Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay, Justice Joseph Story, Justice James Kent, Zephaniah Swift, author of America's first legal text, and the U.S. Supreme Court itself, not to mention the U.S. Congress, as well as numerous state Supreme Courts and state legislatures. Other famous Americans who claimed that America was a Christian nation or was built on Christian principles included leaders such as General William Eaton, leader of America's first war following the American Revolution, and Daniel Webster, the great defender of the Constitution. U.S. presidents declaring that America was a Christian nation or that it was founded on Christian principles included John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Zachary Taylor, Harry Truman, Andrew Jackson, William McKinley, Herbert Hoover, and Teddy Roosevelt. Educational leaders who taught students in classic American textbooks that Christianity was the basis of our country and its government included notables such as Noah Webster, the schoolmaster to America, Jedediah Morse, the father of American geography, and William McGuffey of the famous McGuffey Readers. All of these and so many more founding fathers, leaders, educators, and official departments of government declared that America was a Christian nation or that it was influenced by or built on Christian principles by Christian leaders. Over the 2,000 years that Christianity has been in existence, there's been three distinct periods of Christianity. The Reverend John Wise, who is one of the greatest intellectual leaders in early colonial America, said that the first 3 centuries of Christianity you could characterize as the period of purity. That's where we did exactly what Christ had taught us. We're doing really well. The next 12 centuries, from about 350 AD for the next 12 centuries, you get into a period of apostasy. Starts back with Constantine saying, you know, the church and state ought to be one, and I can be over all of it. And so we have an official church. Then the emperor after him decided to ban all other religions, so he forcibly stopped all other religions, no other religious competition. John Chrysostom, an early bishop, said, you know, the state is not complete until it bows its knee to the church. And so we get into this thing of the two going together.
Right.
And at that point in time where the church becomes a state and the state becomes a church, that's where you get all the atrocities. That's that period of apostasy. But then you get into the last 5 centuries, which is the period of Reformation. That's where we said, no, it's time to get away from traditions. Let's go back to what Christ taught. Let's go back to what those first 3 centuries represented, a period of purity. And over the last 5 centuries, and by the way, when we speak Reformation, today we have a really lousy view of Reformation. We think Reformation is Protestants versus Catholics, and that's not it at all. The Reformation came out of the Catholic Church. It was Catholic priests, Catholic monks saying, let's go back to the Word of God. And then when Henry VIII started the Anglican Church, it was Anglican priests and monks saying, let's go back to the Word of God. It was people saying, let's go back to God's teachings. Now we have a tendency today to say, Martin Luther, that's the Reformation. He nailed the 95 Theses up in 1517. That's the Reformation. Reformation started 200 years before Luther was on the scene.
Wow.
You have Tyndale, who's the morning star of the Reformation. And what happens is the Reformation says we need people to read the Word of God again. Started back in the 1300s with voices saying, let's get back to the Scriptures. And it was not a single individual as Luther. You'll find that there were reformers simultaneously working in Switzerland, working in Netherlands, working in France, working in England. We had all over Europe simultaneously. All these guys are saying, it's time to get back to the Scriptures.
Yeah.
So the Reformation is a movement of returning to purity. Let's go back to the Scriptures. Out of the Reformation, and by the way, you will also find that the Catholic Church ended up adopting so much of what the Reformation advocated at a slower rate because they resisted, but so did the Anglican Church resist. So that's where you come up with a Protestant denomination. These are guys who wanted it to happen faster, so they just kind of started their own group. But the other 2 groups they'd been working with eventually adopted the same principles. So the Reformation moved really all of Christianity back to a much more biblical position.
A closer look into our nation's history reveals surprising and irrefutable evidence of the Bible's influence on our founding fathers and our nation's Constitution. But does a biblically inspired Constitution make America a Christian nation? And is there a place for the Bible in today's society? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
What you're really discussing is the establishment of we are a Christian nation.
Yes, it is a Christian nation. There's a reason that judges and presidents and governors and historians and everyone else for 300 years said we were. Now, just because today we don't know what that is doesn't mean it wasn't true for 3 centuries. See, what they knew that we don't pay attention to today is that when this third period of Christianity came along, this period of Reformation, it resulted in massive changes across the world. Now, what was cool was when these Reformation-minded people came to America, they had something in America we didn't have in Europe. In America, they've come to a virgin land. They're not having to fight the apostasy of the last 12 centuries.
Right.
There's not been an inquisition over here. There's not been a corrupted form of Christianity. They get to plant the pure stuff right here on virgin soil, and so it grows really fast. One of the things you'll find that in every nation where the reformers were working to get people back to the Bible, one of the characteristics was they went to a republican form of government. You'll find the monarchies went away, republics rose. That's a characteristic of a Christian nation, is a republican form of government. It's what we have in America. It's a good thing we're a Christian nation. We like having a republican form of government. Where do we get that? The Bible teaches that you should elect your own leaders.
Right.
See, the divine right of kings, the monarchs are saying, hey, God's into kings. There's 6 books in the Bible that deal with kings, Kings and Chronicles and Samuel. And by the way, we have King David and King Saul and King Solomon and Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and that's right. The Bible has a lot to say about kings. But the Bible also tells us that God sent the prophet Samuel to the people to say, you don't want kings. Bad idea.
Well, he said, I'll give you a king, but they'll rule you.
And they will. And they'll rule you. And you know what was really interesting is he got specific. He said, here's what will happen to your military. Here's what will happen to your property taxes. He went through all these things that would happen if they got a king. They said, we want a king. Well, the reformers come along and say, you know, we've had kings for 1,400 years, but that's not the way God wanted it first.
Right.
What was the first thing God wanted? Exodus 18:21, choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, 100,000s. So getting back to the Bible made us a republican form of government. That's the first thing that came out of the Reformation. So a Christian nation in the last 500 years means you have a republican form of government. I think everyone enjoys that.
Yeah.
Second thing is it was the Reformation that came up with separation of church and state. Everyone enjoys that today too. We appreciate the fact that the government can't tell us how to worship or when to worship or where to worship, and that the church can't go to the government and say, execute this guy. He doesn't believe the right thing.
Right.
Where did that come from? That came from the Reformation, getting back to the biblical teachings. So that's the second characteristic. We appreciate that. The third characteristic was freedom of conscience. You see, every one of the reformers, many were put to death for what they believed about the Word of God. Simply their beliefs got them killed. Tyndale and Huss and other guys were killed because they wanted people to read the Bible in the common man's language. Well, if you don't allow freedom of conscience, then you can't get this other stuff out there. If you're going to have someone control what you think, where'd freedom of conscience come from? It came from all the reformers, all these Christian guys. So when you start a Christian nation, one of the things you find is freedom of conscience. Although Noah Webster taught students that our form of government could not survive unless we kept godly, God-fearing people of faith in office, doesn't the security of our particular form of government really depend upon the people rather than upon their representatives? After all, in a democracy, aren't the people the most important aspect? This is part of our problem today. We think we're a democracy. We're not. Recall, when we pledge allegiance to the flag, we pledge allegiance to the Republic of the United States, not the democracy of the United States. While few today can define the difference between the two, there is a difference, a big difference. Our founding fathers had an opportunity to establish a democracy, and they chose not to. They specifically chose to establish a republic. In their minds, we were not and were never to become a democracy. Founding Father Fisher Ames declared, "A democracy is a volcano which conceals the fiery materials of its own destruction. These will produce an eruption and carry desolation in their way." Founding Father Benjamin Rush was equally pointed. He noted, "A simple democracy is the devil's own government." Founding Father John Adams stated, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." So strongly did the founders oppose a democracy that when they created the Constitution, they included a provision to keep America from becoming a democracy. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution requires that each state maintain a republican form of government. A republican form of government as opposed to a democratic one. That is, to be a republic, not a democracy. What then is the difference between a democracy and a republic? Noah Webster explained that difference. He told students, "Our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. The difference between a republic and a democracy is the source of its authority. In a democracy, whatever the people desire is what becomes policy. If a majority of the people decide that murder is no longer a crime, in a democracy, murder will no longer be a crime. However, not so in our republic. In our republic, murder will always be a crime, for murder is always a crime in the Word of God. It is this foundation which has given our republic such enduring stability, for since man does not change, he continues to need the same restraints he has always needed. It is the rights and wrongs revealed in the Bible which have provided those guidelines for our republic."
You are teaching us the most incredible history Bible lesson that I've ever heard, that is all establishing the foundation that we're talking about today, which is America is
A Christian
a
nation?
Christian
And what
nation.
it breeds is hope.
Oh,
You're giving us
we're
hope.
seeing it.
Well-
When we can see it, Dave, when that's who we were, we can be that
We can
again.
be that.
Yeah.
And see, part of it is recognizing that's who we were. Because these characteristics didn't pop up. These characteristics we're talking about did not come from secular philosophers.
Right.
It was not secular people that came up with separation of church and state. It was not secular people who came up with republican forms of government. It was not secular people who came up with freedom of conscience. It was Christian leaders using the Bible. And these are the civic virtues that we love today.
Yeah.
But we fail to recognize where they came from.
Well, and that foundation is still there. Nobody can take that away.
Well, they're chipping away at it. As a matter of fact, the fourth characteristic of a Christian nation is that it's able to distinguish between theology and behavior. In other words, we can have the Ten Commandments. The court says that's theological. You can't have that. We say that's not theological. That's behavioral. Don't steal and don't kill and don't perjure yourself. That's not a theology issue. That's a behavioral issue.
Right.
So what we're able to do in a Christian nation is say, look, we don't pass laws telling you how to baptize people. We don't pass laws telling you what kind of communion to do, transubstantiation or consubstantiation. We don't pass laws telling you what kind of church government to have, whether it's eclectic form of government or Presbyterian. We don't do that. But we will pass laws that tell you don't kill, don't steal, don't perjure yourself. And yes, they are found in the Bible, but that doesn't make them theological. See, Christian nation, you'll find that Christian nations will legislate on behavioral things that are found in Scriptures, but they don't legislate on theological things that are found in the
Right.
Scriptures. And so that's where America has been from the very beginning. We allowed freedom of conscience. Now, we did say the law of God is going to be the law of the land, and that's why the Ten Commandments hang in government buildings and not church buildings,
Right.
because they're behavioral.
A closer look into our nation's history reveals surprising and irrefutable evidence of the Bible's influence on our founding fathers and our nation's Constitution. But does a biblically inspired Constitution make America a Christian nation? And is there a place for the Bible in today's society? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
In recent decades, as literally dozens of cases have come to the courts. The courts have dealt with the Ten Commandments in dozens of issues. And the courts have taken the position that the Ten Commandments represent a huge theological debate. Now, I've had a lot of fun studying these cases. I can point to a number of them, and the courts point out that there are 4 different theological versions of the Ten Commandments. They say there is a Catholic version, there is a Jewish version, there is a Protestant version, and there is a Lutheran version. Now, this might come as a shock to Lutherans to know that they're not Protestants. I mean, they thought they were at the start of the Protestant, but these great theologians we have on the court now tell us that no, Lutherans and Protestants are different. So what happens is we're told that there's 4 theological versions of the Ten Commandments. And you look into it, and that's why the court says we can't allow the display of the Ten Commandments because that's a Protestant version. They'll think that the government's endorsing Protestantism. We can't allow that. That's a Catholic version. They'll think the government... I challenge any citizen to walk by any Ten Commandments and tell me what theological version it is. We don't look at it to say, oh, that's the Catholic version. Can you imagine a Protestant walking by and say, oh, that one says don't kill, that's a Catholic version, I don't have to obey that, I can kill something. We don't do that. That's not what it's about.
Right.
Do you know what the difference is between the 4 versions? It's only in how they're numbered. That's all. The text is the same from top to bottom, but because they're numbered differently, the Jewish version What the Protestant version has is the prologue, I'm the Lord thy God. That's at the top of most of the Protestant monuments. That's actually commandment number 1 in the Jewish version. It's a matter that if it was in a paragraph, there's no difference. But they number them differently, and the courts have said that's why you can't have it. It's a huge theological debate. No, it's behavioral. It has nothing to do with theology. I don't know of anybody that debates the numbering of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
I was, well, you know, don't kill is actually not 6, it's 5, and therefore we don't do that.
Yeah.
And so the courts are starting to undermine these characteristics where that we could distinguish before between theology and behavior. The court's not doing that anymore.
Understood.
They're saying, you know, oh, that comes out of a religious book. See, we've had the same trouble with teaching premarital sexual abstinence. That's gone to the courts. The court says, that's a teaching you can find in the Bible. No, you can't teach that at schools. That's unconstitutional separation of church and state. They can't make the distinction between theology and behavior, and that undermines a nation.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. The courts have had a tendency to meddle into the 10 Commandments, the biblical spiritual heritage of America, and the way that they've done it, what we're debating today, is that they have made the 10 Commandments, which is the laws of how we should govern ourselves, they've made it a theological debate instead of letting it be behavioral.
Yeah.
Is that basically what they've done to be able to get all
That's
into
right.
it?
Our judges today would have been great in the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, because that's when they debated how many angels would fit on the head of a pin.
Okay.
Who cares?
Yeah.
That doesn't change things. Our judges would have been great as part of that theological debate years ago, because they're into things that nobody cares about, nobody really believes, and it doesn't affect behavior.
Right.
It does for them. See, they have so intermeddled themselves in religious liberty issues that one of the Supreme Court justices has described the Supreme Court as a national theology board. And that's a great description. I mean, they're telling us, oh, you can't display that version of the 10 Commandments because it's numbered differently from this version. That's not what criminal prosecutions are about. I can show you hundreds, and I mean hundreds, close to 800 cases where that the courts have cited the 10 Commandments as the final issue. And they really don't care what number it is. They just say because the law says, because the 10 Commandments say thou shalt not kill, that's why you can prosecute this guy. They don't go into numbering. But suddenly this new court, in order to make things secular, gets into issues that we don't even care about. This biblical heritage was so well understood during the early years of the nation, and the writings of the numerous founding fathers were so well known, that in later years the Supreme Court ruled in the founders' intention, keeping biblical principles as the basis. For example, notice this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The court said, "No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation." What would lead the court to conclude that we are a Christian nation? This case was not long, only 16 pages in the court records, but the court provided 87 different historical precedents to support its conclusions. The court quoted the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Congresses, the acts of the state governments, and so on. At the end of 87 precedents, the court explained that it could continue to cite many additional precedents, but that certainly 87 were sufficient to conclude that we were a Christian nation. The fifth characteristic of a Christian nation that comes from Christians is it's a free market approach to religion. We don't believe in coercion. Matter of fact, you'll find that this Christian nation, Founding Fathers called it Christian nations, courts called it Christian nations, we invited every other religion to come here. We had a lot of Jewish patriots involved in the American Revolution, Jews and Christians side by side. Wasn't a threat at all. We had Muslims here. One of the Founding Fathers was a Muslim. John Randolph of Roanoke was a Muslim Founding Father. Now, he got led to Christ by Francis Scott Key, who did the Star-Spangled Banner, but we had Muslims in early America, we had Buddhists, we had what were called Confucians we had all these religions in early America. We were still a Christian nation. It wasn't because we tried to keep other religions out, it's because we said, you know what? We believe the presentation of truth wins every time.
Right.
We just put it out there, and we invite you to be, we're not threatened by you guys at all. You know what that is? That's like Elijah on the top of Mount Carmel.
I was just thinking that, dude.
Exactly. You know, I have people, they say, oh, I don't want prayer back in schools. If we get prayer back in schools, I don't want my kids hearing a Buddhist pray. Well, number one, Buddhists are not going to pray. They meditate, so you're not going to have to worry about hearing a Buddhist pray. It's not going to happen. But number two, if you're scared of that religion, you're in the wrong religion.
Right.
You ought to be in the one you're scared of. See, Elijah, when they had the false prophets on Mount Carmel, false prophets of Baal, they're praying away. He says, you want more time to pray? Take more time. Take all the time you want. Just make sure I get my shot.
Right.
And that's all it boils down to. And that's the position we had in America. We're not scared of anybody else's religion. We'll let everybody come. It's a free market approach. And that's why we don't use, and we didn't use, coercion. You don't find that in Christian nations. Now, you find that in that middle 12 centuries of apostasy, forced conversions. That's still one of the fundamental tenets of Islam, is forced conversions. It is not of true Christianity.
Right.
So for 5 centuries, we've had a free market approach. Now, you take those 5 characteristics, you say, you know, I like having a Republican form of government where I choose my leaders. I really like having an institutional separation of church and state where the government doesn't run the church and church doesn't run government. I really do like having freedom of conscience to believe what I want. And I really do like having behavioral standards that reflect certain things, even if they're in the Bible. And I really do appreciate the fact that we can choose what religion we want. Welcome to a Christian nation.
Yeah.
See, that's a Christian nation. That's not a theocracy. Those guys that say Christians are trying to impose theocracy, if you look at the last 5 centuries of Christianity in the time of the Reformation, every time Christians got a hold of a government, it was free choice. Choose your own. We don't do theocracies. That's not it. So what's wrong with America being called a Christian nation? Nothing. We see what happens is, since we say we're not a Christian nation and we run from that, then it's easy to make Christians into a fringe element. Oh, it's those radicals out there. We kind of tolerate them. You know, Christian values are no longer part of mainstream. We get in trouble debating Christian values in marriage, debating Christian values in bioethics, debating Christian values. We never debated those values before. Even non-Christians among the founding fathers like Franklin and Jefferson were absolutely advocating Christian values. They may not agree with Christian theology, but who's going to have a trouble with Good Samaritan or with the Golden Rule or with the Beatitudes? Those are Christian teachings.
Right.
They uplift a society. So we've got to get away from being scared to say we're a Christian nation. What we've got to do is define it the right way, define it the historical way. We can't let the left steal 300 years of heritage.
Right.
We can't let them wipe out 300 court cases, wipe out what dozens of presidents and governors have said simply because they don't like the term.
Right.
We are a Christian nation. We have been a Christian nation, and that doesn't mean anything they think it does. We're not theocratic. We're not coercive. We believe in free choice. We don't believe in any of the others. And that's what we've got to get back to doing. We don't need to be ashamed at all that we're Christians and that we believe we have a Christian nation. What we need to do is advocate those civic virtues that are the result of specific biblical teachings that have blessed all of us.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.